Ghost of Tsushima is easily one of my favorite new IPs in years. To inhabit such a beautiful open world as a badass samurai is one of the ultimate fantasies. Ghost of Tsushima was both a critical and financial success for PlayStation Studios, which naturally leads to the question of, when's the sequel? At this point in time, there's no official confirmation that a sequel is in production, but I believe we all know that it's just an unspoken inevitability at this point. So much like my Marvel Spider-Man 2 predictions wishlist, I want to go over the possibilities for the sequel. This video is all about what I think will happen as well as what I want to happen for Ghost of Tsushima 2. Don't hesitate to leave your comments down below. I'd love to get the conversation going. Oh, and last thing, in case it's not obvious, there will be spoilers for both the base game as well as the Iki Island expansion. Now with that out of the way, sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. I think it's important to start with what makes Ghost special. I believe Ghost of Tsushima excels in its basic gameplay loop of visual beauty, satisfying combat, and a minimal UI. Each aspect pushes and pulls off of each other to deliver a captivating experience. Ghost delivered on its core promise of offering a satisfying and immersive samurai experience. For a first installment, Ghost of Tsushima does a lot right. But like any game, it's not perfect. I think a sequel could serve as a perfect opportunity to address certain shortcomings. The first area of improvement I feel needs to be addressed is a greater sense of variety across both missions and activities. Having beaten the base game 3 times and Iki Island twice at this point, I feel Ghost implements a lot of great and creative concepts, but also falls victim to an at times copy and pasted experience. I personally enjoyed chasing one of the foxes to a shrine for the first time, but found the activity to get stale rather quickly, which makes sense when you realize there's 49 shrines in total. There is one shrine you find in ruins activating a small side mission. The mission itself was nothing groundbreaking, but the setup was a pleasant surprise to mix up the player's expectations, which is what I'd love to see more of. This repetitive feeling can also be found in many of the side missions. Most missions start with a conflict of some sort that has Jin talking to some distressed or shady characters. Jin does some investigating, which leads to another conflict and eventually a twisted and tragic revelation or conclusion. This isn't to say there weren't exceptions to this formula, but I'd love to see Sucker Punch flex their creative muscles with some of the non-Golden Path content due to having solid bones in place. This repetitive structure isn't abnormal for the introduction of a new IP when much of the focus is spent on certain core elements. I personally would prefer to have less than half of all the current activities, but with more random encounters to give a feeling of dynamism. Fortunately, it would appear Sucker Punch is already aware of this, with Iki Island content somewhat addressing this. Less important, I personally would like to see Ghost of Tsushima 2 step up its game in animations and cutscenes. Many of the cutscenes rely a little too heavily on generic medium and wide shots. I think part of this is a creative choice to replicate old samurai cinema, but if that's the case, I believe Sucker Punch should really upgrade their animations, similar to that of maybe like a Red Dead Redemption 2. Even if not to the level of Red Dead, which dials the animation department up to a 10, at least less fade to black sequences anytime you interact with an item would go a long way. Related to animations, I think the AI could greatly be improved to not feel so dumb and awkward at times. Both NPCs and enemies could really benefit from this a ton. Climbing is another area that doesn't feel bad, but lacks a sense of freedom when you're going up predetermined paths. I'm becoming a bit of a broken record here if you've watched my other videos, but a climbing system similar to that of Breath of the Wild would do wonders here to add an additional layer of interactivity with the environment. Or another game that does it really well is Assassin's Creed Origins. While the climbing and parkour is overall serviceable with room for improvement in this first installment, the detective elements are not. I don't mind following a set of footprints or scanning an area for clues here and there, but for how often it's utilized, the detective features are sorely lacking and repetitive. They could address this area a few different ways. One is just completely revising and revamping the investigation aspects. The second option would just be to significantly reduce the implementation of these sequences altogether. Either way works for me. With all these complaints, you'd almost think I hate the game. Flaws and all, I still love the game, but after playing through multiple times, I feel there are several low-hanging fruits that are, at least in theory, easy fixes. Now, with some of the negative stuff out of the way, the question we all want to know is, when and where are they going to take the story of Ghost 2? Compared to a game like Marvel's Spider-Man 2, the direction for this sequel is a little less obvious, but I think I've narrowed it down to a few likely scenarios. Many of you may already be aware that there was a second Mongol invasion of Tsushima. The first invasion happened in 1274, while a second occurred in 1281. 7 years would make plenty of time for Jin to change and grow as a character, while still being relatively young. I could see a scenario where Jin is semi-retired, keeping it on the down low when he learns of a second invasion being imminent. Jin then attempts to get help from samurai forces, creating a new conflict in order to help defeat the Mongols for the second time. This has me wondering another big question, and that's the setting. Of course there's Tsushima, and maybe we could see some changes over time with the possibility for an expansion of the map. But if not Tsushima, I think the most likely answer would be to go big with mainland Japan, or at least a portion of it. Going to mainland Japan could introduce all sorts of conflicts with the shogunate, or even the introduction of true ninjas to contrast against the ways of the Ghost. You can't tell me ninjas wouldn't be an awesome new enemy. Regardless of if the sequel takes place on Tsushima or mainland Japan, I see there being some level of conflict centering around the shogunate's disdain for Jin, even with the possibility of a civil war. Another idea could revolve around the corrupt shogunate offering Jin an opportunity to regain his honor and freedom by returning to his ghostly ways to help take out and control a rebellion. Think of a setup somewhat similar to Red Dead Redemption. Back to location, it's possible we could be visiting several different distant but nearby locations, like another set of smaller Japanese islands, or Korea, or even China, bring the fight to the Mongols. On Iki Island, there are several maps inside of Fune's house of what appears to be a few different islands. At first I thought this could be pointing to the possibility of a future location. After messing around on Google Maps, it does appear that the middle map is clearly Iki, with the other two being smaller islands off the coast, Oshima and Hara Island. When it comes to the protagonists of this sequel, they could explore a new protagonist needing to go down their own path, similar to that of the Ghost, or they could revisit a side character like Tomoe, or even go the prequel route with older characters like Jin's father or Lord Shimura. They can also look into doing something a little bit smaller, like what they did with Second Light for a character like Yuna or Norio, but most likely I think we're just going to continue Jin's story. They could introduce some sort of a new supporting character who's learning from Jin the ways of the Ghost. That would be an interesting relation to explore. I think it's a safe assumption to expect fan favorites like Yuna, Kenji, and Norio to make returns of some sort. Lady Masako and Sensei Ishikawa may be retired after their side missions were mostly resolved, but who knows. As far as most likely, I think Jin is either going to go to mainland Japan or remain on Tsushima, with the second invasion being likely but not guaranteed. I also think there will definitely be some element of conflict against the shogunate, with a possibility with the introduction of ninjas. Ghost of Tsushima's base game and Iki Island endings do leave the door open to a sequel, but are fairly contained experiences, so I'm definitely doing a lot of speculation here for sure. As far as the second invasion goes, it's too good to ignore, but with a 7-year gap, I'm debating if they'd want to go that route now when they could save it for a potential third game. Because whether it's Sucker Punch or another studio, you bet Sony will want to pump out more than just 2 of these games. Now let's talk gameplay. I believe Sucker Punch has laid down a fantastic foundation for their combat system going forward. The basic commands of dodge, parry, block, jump, light, and heavy attacks work here better than just about any game I can think of in recent memory. While I don't see the controls changing up much for the sequel, it does seem to be a no-brainer to continue with the stance system, similar to how they implemented before, but with more dynamism, kind of like how it was introduced in the DLC. Depending on where they take the narrative, this will also open up a variety of combat options. If they do end up implementing a samurai civil war, there's a lot of potential to get creative with unique fighting styles, which comes back to the theme of variety. Also, as mentioned earlier, ninjas could really make for some crafty and difficult opponents that keep the player on their toes. We could really get creative with ninjas. Imagine all the possibilities. Imagine you're just walking along and a ninja pops out from being disguised as a rock, or they come flying from above. I mean, you want to be safe anywhere. Now, keeping it under control here, if they do end up going the Mongol route and reusing them, I'd see a decent portion of the enemy types being reused, with some new ones added in to spice things up. When it comes to stealth, I'm sure we'll get an assortment of all sorts of new tools and techniques. Some cool concepts could involve chain weapons or more advanced foot spikes and even hand claws to kind of climb up surfaces previously unreachable. As cool as many of the potential tools could be, when it comes to stealth, the biggest thing is definitely AI. I hope we see major upgrades there to add a real layer of tension similar to what's found in the excellent swordplay. I've gone over a few things that I think will be cool while also being somewhat likely. I do have a few minor to medium wishlist items I'd personally like to see implemented. Starting small and working our way up, I'd love to see more customization of Jin's head and facial hair. The classic messy samurai bun with some stubble is the best all around look, but I'd love to play around with Jin's look a little bit more. Keeping with customization, I really enjoyed the large selection of armor sets and katanas, but I feel it would be really fun to customize your own. This could add to the sense of being one with the blade, or at the very minimum, I think it'd be cool. I also think when it comes to the open world design, it'd be really cool to have a town or two with some scale to kind of offset some of the smaller feeling villages. Adding in a larger or more densely populated area could introduce for some parkour and stealth mechanics, which Sucker Punch already has some experience with due to working on Infamous. This could also make sense from a narrative perspective if they do end up taking the sequel to mainland Japan. More of a personal complaint than anything, but I'd love to see more condensed side stories. I'd rather play 3 to 5 long missions for a particular character over 9 short ones that feel way too similar. My favorite side quests were easily that of Yuna's and Kenji's, and I believe part of this is neither of them overstaying their welcome, or at least to the point where there's, Mission 6 for Lady Masako feels almost the exact same as Mission 3, just with some slight different changes. And with Norio it's even worse because he has 9 missions only spread out through the last 2 sections of the map. I'm not sure if I'm alone here, but I'd love to see less missions for certain characters if they're going to continue relatively simple storylines. If they are going to have 9 missions, I'd like to see a lot more variety as far as the plot. I think characters with fewer but longer missions could really alleviate this for me as well. I'd like to see a mixture of short, medium, and long quests to really give the game a sense of variety overall. Going back to gameplay, I'd also love to explore and battle it out at sea a little bit more. Not quite to the level of an Assassin's Creed Black Flag, but to have more open world exploration and combat really gets the gears spinning in my head. When it comes to release dates, I have no idea. Sequels are hard to predict due to some getting pumped out with just a couple years later, while others seem to take longer than the original, even though the game's basic mechanics and concepts are already established. Sucker Punch is a relatively smaller studio for putting out AAA games, with the original taking around 6 years to make, but from what I understand this also included time spent on a cancelled project. I don't think it will take the studio another 6 years to make the sequel, but it does depend on a few things like how ambitious they get or how many other projects they have lined up, like they could possibly be working on some sort of live service game. Assuming they did begin pre-production shortly after the original title, I think it wouldn't be crazy to expect the sequel sometime around 2024 or 2025. If that is the case, then we may get an announcement at the end of this year or more likely sometime next year. I'd also be on the lookout for a PC port for the first game, since Sony has gotten into the habit of doing this around the time they're trying to hype fans up for the sequel. So to recap, I think Ghost of Tsushima 2 will be coming out sometime in 2024 or 2025, with Jin at the center of the story. Sucker Punch could go a few routes with the location, but I think the 2 most likely options are either going to be continuing the fight on mainland Japan or revisiting Tsushima. I definitely think we'll be experiencing the second Mongol invasion of 1281 at some point, but I'm not 100% sure it will be in this next title. Lastly, I believe the Shogunate will be playing a larger role in the sequel, with some form of a civil war or rebellion to be involved, especially if they're going to not go with the second invasion storyline. Either way, if I'm wrong or right, I'm super excited to see what's next for this IP. I'm hoping we get an announcement sometime this year or no later than next year. What do you think's gonna happen? Make sure you leave a comment before you go, and I'd also greatly appreciate a like. As always, thanks for watching, and until next time, see ya!